Welcome to the session, 2018 Voting Demographics Initiatives. My name is Sanjay Verdilla. I'm with Recon MR. We're a survey research organization based in the U.S. I'm grateful, honored, and nervous to be here. It's my first time moderating. So, I checked the box that said I'll volunteer, and it said 8 a.m. Saturday. So this is my first time, so please bear with me. 2018 was an exciting time in the U.S. election cycle. We all know this. We have 5 compelling presentations today to describe various facets and findings. I'm pleased to introduce a very well-known political scientist, pollster, and just general expert in this field. Our first speaker today is Gary Langer, so please welcome him to the stage. Excellent work so far.
Does the technology work? Thanks, everybody. We are fantastic. Good. Thanks for coming this early Friday morning.
No, Saturday.
Saturday morning. Yeah. Blue waves and white bubbles is this the subject of a blog item I wrote for ABCnews.com right after the 2018 election, and I've been thinking more and expanding more on it, and wanted to offer a more developed version of that topic at today's talk. We know, and I think have been well covered, the demographic changes occurring in this country, but their political impacts are so profound that I think we sometimes underestimate them and don't focus on them as fully as we should. I want to suggest that the demographic face of our nation is changing dramatically with profound current and future impacts on our national politics and on our election. When I talk about demographic changes, I'm going to speak chiefly in this presentation about race and ethnicity. These are the changes that are occurring at such a remarkable pace in our country that are so influential. Indeed, I want to suggest that when we talk about other voting groups, for example, when we talk about the youth vote, we talk about the urban versus rural vote, we are not exclusively, but largely to a substantial extent, in fact, talking about the racial and ethnic vote. So this is something to be slide. Let's see where we go. The 2018 election was described by some as a blue wave, and we can just look at some of the midterm results and see where that description comes from. What we saw in this election of the largest Democratic House gain since 1974. Record high turnout among Hispanics in a midterm election. A record turnout among non-whites overall. Near record Democratic vote among blacks and Hispanics alike. A record Democratic vote among Asians, and vast divisions among whites by sex and education. For example, college-educated white women voted 59% Democratic, where non-college white men voted 66% for Republican House candidates. All these comparisons are from national exit polls conducted for the network since 1976. This shows us the share of white voters in midterm elections across the relevant period, in this case in exit polls since 1990. A pretty dramatic change over time. There were some suggestions that what we saw in turnout among whites was an Obama effect, but it actually preceded the Obama presidency and has continued past the Obama presidency. There's the share of white voters in presidential as opposed to midterm elections. While meanwhile, the share of black, Hispanic, and net non-white voters has increased dramatically. That top blue line, you can see that the number of non-white voters in our national midterm elections has gone from less than 10% to nearly 30% across this period. And that much of the gain has been among Latinos, as you can see in the green line at the bottom. In presidential elections, similar, if anything, even more pronounced. We've gone from 10 to 30% non-white vote. Why does this matter? Why is this relevant to us? We'll look in a second at how non-whites and the components of the non-white population vote. And by the way, I just want to mention that describing people by who they are not
is infelicitous, but saying people of color over and over again is awkward. So I'm going to use the term non-whites, but it's not the best term to use. Just to summarize what I just showed you, you can see that the gap in turnout among whites versus non-whites has gone in the period I just presented from 82 points at the start to 44 points now. And that's in midterms, and in presidential elections, very similar. And if we project forward, we do a linear regression into the future, it tells us that should these patterns continue, and demographic patterns tend to do that, then we'd be at the point of parity, at the point at which non-white electorate in our country would exceed the white electorate in about 40 years, which is sooner than you think. It matters because of how these groups vote. Non-whites net very consistently at 70 to 80% vote for Democratic candidates. And whites quite consistently, as you see, this period in this case goes all the way back to 1976. 4 in 10 non-whites vote for Democratic candidates, around 6 in 10 vote for Republican candidates. And these have been really consistent trends over time. So the fact that the non-white vote is this dramatically increasing slice of the pie makes a fundamental difference. If we break it down among non-white groups, we can see that the vote among blacks, the top line, is consistently between 80 and 90% Democratic. By Latinos, more in the high 60s, mid to high 60s, and the net is the blue line in between. If we go into some detail, we can see that, again, among whites, a little more than 40% in 2018 voted for Democratic candidates for House, meaning nearly 60% voted for Republicans. Compare that to the national vote for House candidates in 2018 among blacks, Asians, Hispanics, and those of other races, all a considerably more Democratic vote. Non-whites and whites, again, we have that net non-white vote for Democratic versus Republican House candidates compared to whites. We've also noted and talked after the election about the youth vote and about the urban versus rural vote, and we saw a much stronger Democratic vote among the youngest voters, declined pretty linearly with age, and in cities as compared to rural areas. If we break it down by age group, you can see that it is quite linear. Look at the percent non-white by age and the percent non-white by urbanicity. This is the piece that we often don't discuss. We'll talk about the youth vote as if it is clearly or purely a function of age, when in fact what we see is that the race and ethnicity of the population makes for a dramatic difference. And it's largely true in cities as well. Just look at voters age 65 and older in 2018, 82% of them were white. Look at voters under 30 in 2018, 55% of them were white. Now, if we took the percent Democratic vote by race and ethnicity in those two groups, it's a pretty important, I think, distinction. If whites age 65 and older voted about, again, 40% for Democrats. It's non-whites, 65 and older, voted overwhelmingly Democratic, as did non-whites, 18 to 29, the far bar on the right. So the difference here by age is not in the vote by these groups, but in the size of these groups. We do it by urbanicity as well. The Democratic vote among non-whites is much higher in rural areas and indeed across the board. Now, it's not as high in rural areas as it is in urban areas, but it is still far higher than it is among whites. The reason that we see a much less Democratic vote in rural areas is because there's many fewer whites there. When we run this out in regressions, using our standard demographics, as you can see, after conservatism, ideology, and partisanship, the single strongest predictors of Trump approval currently are being black and Latino. If we look at predicting Trump vote or intention to vote for Donald Trump in 2020 for re-election, these are the folks who say they either definitely will or will vote for him or will consider him. Again, being black and Latino are the two of the strongest predictors, and sort of the three horsemen of presidential approval and of intention to vote for Trump are ideology, partisanship, and race and ethnicity. And some of these other factors that we hear so much talk about, age and rural residents, for example, fall out of the equation. They're not predictors. So the fundamental point here is that we have a large and increasing non-white population, one that will indeed exceed in terms of voting participation the white population in the next few decades. And it's important to note that these trends are reflected in census projections as well. This is the proportion that support or consider Trump. Look at whites and look at non-whites, the growing share of the population. If we look at voters age 18 and 29 versus 65 by race and ethnicity, again, in more detail, this shows us where the population's future is going. Among those, among whites, the older population, 65 and up, dominates. Among blacks, it's near parity. And then among Hispanics and Asians, the two most democratic, Asians are one of the more democratic groups, and blacks as well. We have this increasing share of young folks. In the long-term future, if we look at recent census reports, the number of states with a lifetime fertility rate above the replacement level, national assessment at the state level for non-Hispanic white women is 0. For non-Hispanic black women, 12 states have the fertility rates above replacement, and for Hispanic women, 29 states. Again, it's an indication of the demographic future of the country. A further census analysis, this was produced last year, talked about population changes overall and the sources behind them. By 2020, a majority of children are projected to be a race other than non-Hispanic white, and that figure is projected to rise in the coming decades. If you look at the census projections, similarly to the vote participation projections, they show substantially more non-whites than whites in our nation's population by 2060, with the flip occurring right around 2040, 2045. So this demographic change is pretty inexorable. It seems to me that it creates political challenges to some extent for both parties. For Democrats, it's about geographic distribution. As I showed you, you simply don't have that many core Democratic voters, particularly white, non-white voters, I should say, in the rural areas. They overvote in urban centers. Just a chart, this is from 2016, at the county level, shows us the distribution of Democratic versus Republican vote. The reason the Democrats are competitive is because when you're weighted to population, you can see how they overvote in their counties. But there's a different challenge facing for Republicans, and this is this demographic change coming down the highway. And Republicans, it seems to me, have just two choices, which is to appeal more broadly to white and non-white voters, or in the rearguard action that some are voting now is to try to suppress the vote among this population. But that's not a winning strategy for the long term. The Republican Party is more or less running out of white people. And I would think that our Republican friends will need to address that if they want to prevail in future elections moving ahead. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, there's a lot happened in 2016 and 2018, and thanks for the analysis of it. There's going to be an exciting 2020 cycle. Let me get this other one queued up. Here we go. Okay. Next, we have from the AP, Emily Swanson is here, and she's going to be talking about dissecting the urban and rural divide, analyzing demographic differences in voting behavior and political attitudes within community types. Would you please welcome Emily Swanson? Thank you. Okay. Ready? You can just take it over.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to be talking to you about the urban-rural divide in 2018, and in particular, how we can take a look at demographics and place in the 2018 election using AP Votecast. This is our new election survey, which we debuted in 2018, and we're really excited to have as a resource to study what happens in American elections. And this presentation is a collaboration with my colleague, AP polling reporter Hannah Fingerhut. So the general outlines of this should look pretty familiar to everyone in the room, even if the exact numbers are a little different depending on the source. In the 2018 election, as in many other recent elections, there was a substantial divide between Americans living in urban, suburban, and small-town rural areas in terms of how they voted. And this is a divide that has grown in recent years. In particular, this analysis by the Pew Research Center shows that urban areas have become more Democratic and rural areas have become more Republican, and suburban areas have more or less remained fairly closely divided in their partisanship over the last 20 years. As I mentioned earlier, we have a brand new lens through which to look at this divide. In 2018, we debuted our new election survey, AP Votecast, and this is a product that we're really proud of, and it has some key advantages that allow us an in-depth look at Americans in each community type. In total, we interviewed nearly 140,000 registered voters, including more than 115,000 who we identified as voters in that election. And we'll be focusing here on people who we did identify as 2018 voters. We asked respondents to self-identify if they lived in an urban, suburban, small town, or rural area. And as you can see, we have very robust sample sizes across each of these types of communities. I'd like to talk in a little bit more detail about how having people our decision to have people self-identify for this survey. There are a variety of ways of classifying these community types, and the fact is that all of them have some benefits and drawbacks. We know that county and zip code approximations do have a lot of noise associated with them. It's frankly hard to come up with an objective definition of these community types. But self-identification is obviously also a subjective measure, and it could be driven in part by the perceived desirability of each community type. So I am going to just show you briefly the distribution of our self-identified community type against the 6 county-level classifications used by the CDC. And you can see they definitely do not line up perfectly, but I think the distributions that you see here largely do make sense in terms of the largest groups falling into each of these self-identified community types. One thing I found kind of interesting is that about half of the people who would be classified as urban in this county-level scheme actually identify as suburban, and there's probably a bit of subjectivity to that, but there can be significant variation in communities with these counties, and I think a lot of these people aren't necessarily wrong in that classification. So that's not to say that this self-ID scheme is better, but just to lay out there what we're doing here, and we are going to be sticking with that measure for the rest of this presentation. I'm going to go quickly over a few additional details about how Votecast works. It uses 3 sample sources, state voter files, NORC's probability-based Amerispeak panel, and non-probability online panels. And you can see how the sample broke down for each of those here. The survey is conducted in English and Spanish, and the 2018 survey was in the field for 8 days up to and through Election Day. The 3 sample sources are separately weighted by key demographics. The non-probability cases are then calibrated using an MRP model, and then the samples are combined and further refined using a small area model. And once votes are counted, the data is weighted to vote totals in each state within small geographic regions, which adds an additional layer of refinement to post-election estimates of voter attitudes, opinions, and demographics. So I won't go into all the details here of how this went, because we have an entire panel of presentations dedicated to this topic later today. But the short answer is that we are extremely happy with it, and we hope that you will join us at our panel this afternoon in this very lovely room. And that panel will also have fairly exhaustive methodological details beyond what I've discussed here, and an assessment of how it performed. So what did we find? First of all, a quick discussion of the demographics, which do differ somewhat across urban, suburban, and rural areas. And these differences do explain a lot of what's going on with this divide. Urban residents are younger and more diverse, while urban and especially suburban residents are more likely to have college degrees. But as I'll show in the remainder of this presentation, even within demographic groups, there's often significant variation by community type. Now moving on to how place interacted with demographics in terms of voting behavior. Within each age group, you can see there's significant variation in votes by community type, with rural residents always more likely to support Republicans, urban residents always more likely to support Democrats, and suburban residents generally falling in between. And among young people, suburban voters are a little bit more similar in their voting behavior to urban voters than to rural voters. Looked at a little differently, you'll see that there's a significant age gap in suburban and small-town rural areas, but relatively minimal age gap in urban areas. So in urban areas, about 7 in 10 voters across age groups supported Democrats in 2018, whereas among small-town and rural areas, just 39% of voters age 45 plus supported Democrats, and 51% of those under 30 did. Votecast also found that there's a fairly consistent gender gap across community types, but that place makes a big difference among both men and women. Notably, when we're talking about divisions by community type, we're usually talking about white voters, and you can see here that there's, in fact, a very dramatic difference in voting behavior by community type among white voters. On the other hand, there's essentially no such division among black voters. But there is some division by community type among Hispanic voters, and it doesn't look exactly what we see among white voters. But in particular, urban Latinos were much more likely to say they vote for Democrats than either suburban or rural Latinos, who are fairly similar to each other. Although about 6 in 10, at least 6 in 10 across each of these community types did say that they voted for Democrats, but it was more like 3/4 in urban areas. I'll also speak briefly about Asian American voters, where we see relatively minimal division across community types, with urban Asian voters just a little bit more Democratic than rural Asian voters. Our survey was conducted in English and Spanish, and not in any Asian language, which is an important caveat here. We also don't have the sample size necessarily among this group to go into significantly more depth than this within community types, as we will for some of the other racial and ethnic groups, but we did want to address this group briefly. So if we break things down a little further, we see a fairly uniform gender gap among white voters across community type, fairly minimal gender gap among black voters, but there's a fairly interesting pattern among Hispanic voters where we see a significant gender gap in suburban and rural areas, but very little gender gap in urban areas. It's about 3/4 of both men and women among Hispanics in urban areas who say they voted for Democrats. Among white voters, as most of us in this room know, education levels have been a big predictor of vote choice in recent elections. And our survey confirms this is true and that it's true across community types. But I also want to point out that community type matters quite a bit within each education group. So urban non-college white voters are about 20 points more likely to vote for Democrats than their small town and rural counterparts. And there's a similar gap among college-educated voters. So it ends up being about half of non-college white voters in urban areas who say they vote for Democrats, and about 4 in 10 college-educated small town and rural voters who say the same. Across community types, there are relatively small gender gaps among white voters without college degrees, but larger ones among those with college degrees. The gap between men and women among college-educated voters is especially stark in urban areas at 18 percentage points. I'm also going to talk a little bit about religion here, and particularly identification with born-again Christianity, which, especially among white voters, we know is closely related with support for Republican political candidates. And we see here that white voters in small town and rural areas are more likely than those in urban or suburban areas to identify as evangelical Christians. And this is actually true among black voters as well. You can see the gap among African Americans is actually a little bit smaller, even as overall identification with born-again Christianity is higher. White born-again Christians across community type are much more likely to vote for Republicans than for Democrats, but there are some differences here by community type. So in particular, among urban white evangelicals, it's about a third who say that they vote for Democrats, whereas it's only about 20% of those in suburban areas and 15% of those in small town and rural areas. On the other hand, in terms of voting behavior, again, among blacks, we see a fairly uniform support for Democratic political candidates. So I also want to talk about how this divide plays out on important issues facing the country. On a lot of issues, for example, healthcare, you see the divides that are very similar to what you see on vote choice. And you can see here among white voters in 2018, there's a big divide across community types in terms of support for repealing the ACA. Among black voters, there's very little divide, and among Latinos, there's about a 10-point gap between urban voters and everybody else, just like we saw on vote choice. Similarly, among white voters, there's significant division between college and non-college whites across community types, and again, we see community type matters a great deal within each of these groups. And this is the view that immigrants who are in the country illegally should be deported. And again, you see white rural voters much more likely than others to support that. There's relatively low support across the board among black or Hispanic voters, but again, among Latino voters, you do see a bit of a gap between urban and small-town rural voters. Again, you see fairly similar gaps among white voters with and without a college degree. On race relations, and especially the view that white Americans have more advantages than black Americans, again, we see a very similar pattern. Although among Latinos, there's an even starker divide between urban voters and everyone else. And among white voters, there's a bit of a larger gap between rural and suburban areas than we saw on voting behavior. Across community types, we also see even larger divides by education among whites than on several of the other issues that we looked at, along with voting behavior. So these are more like 20-point gaps than 10-point gaps. But again, you do see that where you live matters a lot within these groups. Gun policy, again, very similar among each of these groups, although among whites in particular, there's a somewhat larger gap between people in rural areas compared with everybody else. And also here you start to see a little bit of a gap among black voters, and in particular, African Americans in small town and rural areas are a little less likely to want stricter gun laws than those in suburban areas. So with somewhat of an exception in gun policy, we've seen throughout this presentation fairly minimal division by community type among black voters. But there are some issues where community type does appear to make a difference in views of black voters. And in particular, those are often social issues often associated with morality. As you recall, black voters in small town and rural areas were also more likely to identify as born-again Christians. So I'll touch on a couple of those briefly. Black voters in small town and rural areas are significantly less likely than those than other African Americans to say that abortion should be legal most or all of the time. Although there's a 6 in 10 majority who say that, it's more like 3/4 in both urban and suburban areas. And that's very similar to the pattern among both white and Hispanic voters. And similarly, African American voters in urban areas are also more likely than those in small town and rural areas to support marijuana legalization, just like among white voters. And we see a smaller gap here among Latinos. So some takeaways: community types differ in their demographics, but the demographics do make a big difference within community type. When we talk about the urban-rural divide on voting, we're not talking about a uniform divide across demographic groups. As we saw, there are gaps among white voters but not black voters, and there are gaps among Hispanic voters, but it's between urban voters and everybody else. But even among groups like African Americans, who generally vote similarly no matter where they live, there are differences on some issues across community types. Demographics also sometimes interact in unexpected ways within community types. So, for example, we saw that the gender gap collapses among Hispanics in urban areas, but expands among college-educated whites. So thank you, everyone, for coming, and I hope you'll also come again to our panel this afternoon, while we're going to talk in even more gritty detail about Votecast, how it worked, and cool things that we can do with it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Emily. Great presentation. Healthcare in the U.S. is a very hot topic, as it was on the ballot in 2018. Next, we have Mollyann Brodie from the Kaiser Family Foundation. Her topic today is healthcare on the ballot in 2018, findings from 2018 election polls. Mollyann Brodie. Let me see if I can do this.
Always the key of a good moderator. Get the technology.
What's this?
And Chris and Ashley.
Yes, the artist formerly known as Ashley. Good. And slideshow. Ready?
Yep.
There you go.
Hi, good morning, everyone. The work I'm presenting today comes from the work that the entire polling team at the Kaiser Family Foundation does, who are mostly sitting here. So Liz Hamill, Luna Lopez, Ashley Kurtzinger, and Kaylee, who seems to have gone off to learn something else, which is excellent. So I'm really talking on behalf of all of us. As opposed to the previous panel members, my esteemed panel members, who happen to be colleagues I really respect and who I also really enjoy learning from, they spend all their time, or a lot of their time, a lot of you probably in the room spend your time studying voting outcomes and these voting demographics or whatever that are really important. What we do at the Kaiser Family Foundation is we spend our time thinking specifically about healthcare and people's experiences, beliefs, and opinions, their values that relate to healthcare policy. And then that means sometimes do those things interact with elections? And I would say in the recent past that has been more often than not. So, but today I'm going to take a slightly different tack than what Gary and Emily did, because I want to talk about why healthcare is an issue and why it was such a topic of discussion during the 2018 election, and then what role it may play as we head into 2020. As a bit of just honesty, even though I focus on healthcare, it's not that I think that issues themselves, and everyone in this room, I assume, would agree, that issues are just one of many factors that play a role in any campaign. Certainly what we already heard is there's lots of other things that impact how election outcomes occur. Demographic changes, for example. Referendums on a president, for example. There's a lot of things that were impacting 2018 outcomes, and I don't want to imply that it was healthcare. But in sort of no uncertain terms, if you take yourself back to the 2018 campaign, you heard a lot about healthcare. It was certainly ubiquitous on the campaign trail. And I would say that is particularly true for Democrats. And what I want to do is just spend a few minutes talking about that. This is some data from our friends at the Wesleyan Media Project. They analyze all the campaign ads over the course of campaign seasons. What this shows is the share of all campaign advertising that focused on the issue of healthcare. And there's a couple things to note on this slide. The first thing is that the share of ads that were focused on healthcare in 2018 is much greater than the share that you saw in the previous 5 election cycles. The second thing to note is that the blue bars, that is the share of Democratic produced ads, was about twice as likely to talk about healthcare than Republicans in 2018. And the third thing to note is that that's a big shift from the earlier elections, right? Healthcare really flipped as an issue that was the focus of ads as produced by Democrats or Republicans. Now, that's what we have to pay a little bit of attention to. And what's funny about that is, for those of you who haven't been around as long as some of the rest of us, this is actually a shift back to normal, right? Healthcare was always the issue for the Democratic Party. And if you look at any campaign period prior to this, I would almost, I could, bet on the fact that it's going to be healthcare that was much more likely to be talked about by the Democrats. But during this period, in the 2000s, the late 2010, 2012, 2014, Republicans were able to use that issue in the campaigns. And that really stems back to the passage of the ACA and Obamacare. And it was passed into law on March 2010, and it's been almost a decade of political controversy on the law ever since. And I hate to take you that far back in history, but it really is relevant for today's discussion. So I think many of you know that one of the things we do at the Kaiser Family Foundation is we do our Kaiser Health Tracking Poll, which is dual frame RDD telephone survey that we put into the field every month. Mostly, we call it a tracking poll. We don't track a lot of things every month. We take the opportunity to figure out what's on the healthcare agenda for the public and to be able to tackle whatever policy issues are breaking through the news in a given month. But one question we do ask every single time, which means there's like 125,000 respondents in this time trend, is your favorable, or whether you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the ACA, of Obamacare. And this is our trend chart. I'm sure many of you have seen it in the past. The orange line is the share who have an unfavorable view. The blue line is the share that has a favorable view. And really what you have to take away from this is, if you kind of squint a little bit, you're kind of seeing three horizontal lines, right? It's been a divided America on this issue from the beginning. There's certainly some periods of changing, some periods where there were some highs and some lows in unfavorability, and some of that can be attributed to the events of the time. But in general, you see a divided, stable opinion. But do notice that at the end of this trend line, since President Trump got elected, the blue line has consistently been above the orange line. So that means that favorable views have exceeded unfavorable views for this entire period of time. And that's particularly true since the repeal and replacement efforts of the ACA failed early in the administration. Now, this moment in time is really critical in explaining why the Democrats have been able to reclaim this issue and really embrace healthcare as their topic again. The ACA became under threat. That Democrats and independents who lean Democrats rallied around the ACA because they got quite insecure about the fact that it could be going away for real. There were actually votes to take it away. And we saw this slight increase in favorability as a result of that. And it's maintained that gap ever since. Now, what happened is, even though the Republicans had been able to use this one-line mantra, repeal and replace, and I know that is something you've heard, they used it for all those other election cycles. They've used it as their number one sort of healthcare position. The challenge is that a phrase is not necessarily a policy. And when it came time to actually figure out what a replacement plan would be, when people started learning about it, it turns out people didn't like so much what they heard. So here's a chart that just shows a lot of different people's polling on the replacement plan over this period of a policy debate. The orange again is opposition, blue is favorable, and you could see these replacement plans never really generated a lot of favorability. Part of that stemmed from what the replacement plans would do. And when we asked people about those specifics that were included in the replacement plans, we note here that many of those provisions were actually quite unpopular and opposed by majorities, including majorities of Republicans. And if you look down this chart, the one I circled at the very bottom is the one that actually is the next step in our tale of why healthcare is garnered such an important position in the 2018 election. And that's because one of the things that was going to happen with these replacement plans, they would have unraveled the insurance protections against prohibiting insurance companies from discriminating against coverage and price for people with pre-existing conditions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but the bottom line is that repeal failed. Democrats rallied around the ACA in a way that they hadn't consistently over the period before. And with the failure of the repeal and replacement efforts, Republicans sort of lost their ability to fight beat this drum on repeal and replace. So I think that is enough to suggest why Democrats might have been able to reclaim the issue. But there was this other little thing that happened that's worth taking a minute on, and it happened in June of 2018. So prior to this, there had been a court case that was brought by 18 Republican attorney generals. And they basically sued the federal government. They sued the federal government because they felt that the ACA was rendered unconstitutional as a result of the recently enacted Republican-passed tax law. And if you really want to know more of those details, we can talk about it in Q&A. But the bottom line is that you had Republican attorney generals, state attorney generals, suing the federal government. And that was making its way through court with little fanfare. You might have heard about it. You might not have heard about it. But then in June 2018, the Trump administration did something that was actually quite extraordinary. They came out with a legal brief that stated that they were, even though they are the federal government, they would not defend the ACA. They weren't going to defend against the plaintiffs on one piece of that case, and that was they were agreeing basically with the plaintiffs that, or the Republican attorney generals, they were agreeing with them that the ACA pre-existing condition protections was now unconstitutional. Okay, so funny enough, that made news. And whether it was an unintended consequence or not, it gave the Democrats a real opening to argue to the public yet again that the ACA was under threat, especially this beloved provision that affects more than half of American households. More than half of American households tell us that they or somebody in their house has a pre-existing condition that would make it, if we went back to the good old days, it would make it, their insurance policies could cost more, they could not get coverage, they could get policies that excluded coverage for their particular condition, like cancer, for example, pregnancy, for example, lots of other things that are considered pre-existing conditions. So what this did is it created a very complicated situation for Republicans. They somehow had to say that they were for pre-existing condition protections, but they had to be against the ACA, and then they also had to not piss off the administration. Okay, so what we observed was a flurry of ads like this one. This one is one of my favorites, and if I had trusted technology, I would have actually shown the ad, but I don't trust technology at all. So we did these little still life, and I'm going to read you sort of what it says. But this is an ad by Democratic West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, and he said, "That's me shooting the cap and trade bill because it was bad for West Virginia. Hey, I haven't changed. I might be a few years older, but I still take on anyone that messes with West Virginia. Now the threat is Patrick Morrisey's lawsuit to take away health care from people with pre-existing conditions. He is just dead wrong, and that ain't going to happen." And then imagine the gun goes off, right, and he shoots it. "I'm Joe Manchin, and I approve this message because for me, it's all about West Virginia." Anyway, surprise, surprise, when our friends at the Wesleyan Media Project quoted all their ads for what topic within healthcare was the focus of the ad, guess what? Coverage for pre-existing conditions hit at the top. So I would argue that because of these multiple sort of policy and political components of healthcare, we saw in all the polling leading into the election that healthcare was at the top of the public's priority list when it came to issues that were important to them. Certainly, as you could imagine, at this time around, that was something that was much more likely to be said by Democratic voters and independent voters. Republicans were much more concerned about immigration and gun policy, immigration and the economy. And then what did we see? You've already heard from Gary and from Emily about what actually happened in the vote outcomes. But at the end of the day, on the exit polls, 41% of voters said that healthcare was an important issue to them, and 69% said it needed major changes. And it was, I think, an ubiquitous part of that campaign. I hope I'm not doing okay on time, but okay. So I want to talk a little bit about what this now means as we're headed into 2020. I think given the tale I just told you, it might not be so surprising that when we talked to the public right at the beginning of this year, in January of 2019, and we asked them what they wanted Congress to focus on when it came to healthcare, so this is within the healthcare topic, surprise, surprise, making sure that the ACA's pre-existing condition protections would continue, ranked number one, particularly for Democrats and independents. I think you need to note that it's lower for Republicans, and in fact, even today, or even earlier this year, Republicans still say their number one healthcare priority is repealing and replacing the ACA. I think it's also worth noting on here the other red arrow that shows that 20% of Democrats ranked implementing a national Medicare for All plan as an important priority. And I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But the bottom line, I think, that comes from this chart is that we're going to hear two very different healthcare conversations in the primaries, right? Democrats are going to be talking about protecting the ACA, and they're going to be talking about Medicare for All. And Republicans, I don't think will be talking much about healthcare, but when they do, they're going to be talking about repealing and replacing again. And leading into the general election, I expect them to be, let's talk about Medicare for All in a second. Sorry, let's pause on that. Okay, so there's something to remember as we head into this campaign series for season for all of you who are watching it. This little court case that I was talking about, well, guess what? In December, the judge in the court case ruled with the plaintiffs and basically said the ACA is unconstitutional. So technically, there's a massive threat out there for the ACA to go away yet again. It's working its way through the court process. It'll go to appeal. There are many analysts who think it'll go all the way to the Supreme Court. Point being, if and when these court cases get decided, that could introduce just a moment, I should say. I was going to say a bomb, but I'm on TV. It could introduce a moment into the campaign that could fanatically shift the conversation again. So you got to watch for that one. And then there's this little thing called Medicare for All. And it's worth taking a second to talk about this. It is a priority issue for the progressive wing of the party. They and a whole bunch of advocates are really forcing Medicare for All to be front and center of the discussion. You can see this is just all the Democratic candidates so far. I mean, what date are we in? I mean, we're so far away. They're already declaring positions on this issue. There is no way that in the time I have allotted, we can have a full discussion of the policy and the politics of Medicare for All. But I'm going to give you a couple little tidbits. But needless to say, there's not just one Medicare for All policy proposal. Medicare for All is in many ways a misnomer. It's not Medicare. It's sometimes not even for all. Like, you got to think about all that stuff. We can talk about some of that in Q&A if you want. But clearly the candidates already have feel the need to have to create to be staking out their space on this position. We've been tracking this issue, surprise, surprise, back to the 90s, and we have seen a slight, moderate uptick in favorability or in this idea. So about 56% today say that they like or they favor, some version of an Americans will get their health insurance from a single government plan. And no surprise, there's a large partisan divide on that. And in fact, we've started to see in our tracking polls that this partisan divide is enhancing as the conversation goes on. In the old days, the term Medicare for All was even sort of popular among Republicans. It didn't, got positive response, and that's totally falling away as it becomes more politicized. As you all know, A popular phrase like Medicare for all is not the same as actual policy. So anytime you give any more information, you give arguments, you change your language and how you're talking about it, it matters a lot to what result you get. So here, as we told people that the Medicare for all could do a variety of things, you can see we can get a plus 45 favorability all the way down to a negative 44 favorability. So point being, for all you people tracking this out there, please don't take any single question as actually really shedding full light on how people feel about this. The other thing is to remember, at this stage in the game, nobody understands what a Medicare for all plan would do. For example, 55% of the public think that under a Medicare for all plan, they would be able to keep their current health insurance. And if you look at this chart, the next pie in the middle, 67% of those who favor Medicare for all think they can keep their current health insurance coverage, okay? That's not necessarily how most of these plans are designed to work. You need to know that 156 million people, more than half of the American public, get their health insurance through the employer-based system, and that means private plans. They would, in many of these plans, go away. Nobody understands that. Liz was just conducting focus groups all over the country, and it was hilarious. People didn't even believe her when she said the plan said the private plans would go away. They said, no, they're not. The private insurance companies aren't going to go away. They'll stay. There'll be a role for them, and we'll still get our health insurance that way. So nobody understands what these things mean, so remember that. The other thing just to remember is that there isn't one Medicare for all proposal. There are a variety of them. Some of them are more incremental. Some of them are more optional. When we talk about things that are more optional, more incremental, they garner more support. That's, I think, important opportunity for the Democrats, right? It gives them some more options to talk about and some places to turn where they can keep sort of more people sort of on their side. But one of the real, I think, challenges for Democrats is this sense that this could end up being a very divisive issue for the party in the primaries. Even today, when we ask Democrats what they want their party leaders to focus on, we see that more want to focus on improving and protecting the ACA than passing a Medicare for all bill. So I think that this is definitely be a key issue to watch especially in the primary period, as the progressives and moderates sort of fight for dominance in the party. The way I'm thinking about is Medicare for all is likely to be divisive. There's a chance it could be decisive for some candidates. We'll see, but it's going to then have a different role in the general election, and everything that you've heard about the great political divide in healthcare between Republicans and Democrats for the last 10 years on the ACA is nothing compared to what I think you would hear about if there was really Medicare for all was a key issue in the general election. You've already heard the Republicans calling it socialized medicine and these kinds of things. So you can just imagine what that conversation is going to be like. So I guess the one prediction I feel pretty confident making is that we're all going to hear a lot about healthcare in 2020. And if you do want to learn more about Medicare for all, the Kaiser Family Foundation is having a free web briefing on Tuesday. You're welcome to dial in, and our Medicare experts and are going to be talking about the policies, and I'm going to be talking about more on these details. But thank you.
All right, thank you. So I have good news and interesting news. Interesting news is perhaps our last two speakers are unavailable. So we're going to, I haven't seen them. So we'll just, but the good news is now the floor is open for an extended, in-depth round of questioning with our three guests. So we have Gary, Mollyann, and Emily are here. So please step forward, ask away. We've got time. So no rush. All right. Thank you.
Gary, and this is my question for you and anybody else. Is there a standard question in surveys that's generally accepted among the voters about are you Hispanic? What is your definition of Hispanic? Because I think there are very, very different definitions. The second question is there a standard protocol for having bilingual Spanish and English surveys? I don't think all the surveys have Spanish speaking interviewers, so does depend on who's not the responsible Hispanic, depending on whether the interview was conducted in Spanish.
Yeah, so two quick questions. Is that picking up? I can speak without it.
You can step up here if you want.
No, it's all right. So two quick questions, quick answers to that. One is, I think there are pretty standard questions on race and ethnicity. I don't know exactly how Kaiser or AP ask it. We ask it, are you of Hispanic or Latino origin or descent? I think that is our question. And followed by a question is, are you white, black, or some other race, or something like that, or what's your race? I don't recall exactly. They're asked separately. Typically the Hispanic or Latino origin and descent question comes first, and then we ask about race. But for political purposes, while being Hispanic is not a racial category, it's an ethnic origin, we break Hispanics out as that separate racial / ethnic group because they're distinctive politically. As far as your second question, I don't think any truly credible national public opinion poll can or should be conducted these days without being conducted in Spanish. And virtually all are. About 20 to 25% of Hispanics are Spanish dominant, prefer to be interviewed in Spanish. If they're 15% of the population and 20 or 25% of them want to be interviewed in Spanish, as a net across the total population, it doesn't matter probably much, but the attitude's been well established in a variety of presentations of Spanish-speaking versus English-dominant Hispanics is different. And particularly if you're going to analyze them as a distinct subgroup, you definitely want both languages.
Great question. Who's next? Go ahead.
I think I understand your question. We ask that question only among Democrats because that's really the issue there, right? So what we ask for the general public, where we do, and we have plenty of data we can show you, is just what's their healthcare priority, what they want to focus on. That's a little bit that first question I showed you, where Republicans end up picking, repealing, or replacing the ACA. The other thing I should say, which what I would always say when I'm talking to any audience about the role of healthcare is it all really comes down to an underlying concern about cost, and that's sort of the issue for everyone. So when we go a step further and say, what do you mean by healthcare? If we do it when we talk about more general, like if you say you care about healthcare, what do you mean? It's always my costs, right? And that's the underlying sort of anxiety that plays itself out in these policy discussions. But in a lot of our ranking questions where we have we'll do things like where we talk about prescription drug costs or other costs, then you get a lot more agreement across partisans about how important those issues are and as a priority. So I don't know if anybody was...
Yes, sir.
No, I mean, as I was saying, in more general questions, prescription drug pricing and prescription drug costs is a really important issue across all partisans. It's the one bipartisan issue, right? So there is a reason that in this particular Congress, one of the only things they're talking about and one of the only things they might actually make some progress on is prescription drug costs. And you're seeing some of that. You're seeing there's a new rule that says you have to have the list price in ads and things like that. And that is because it is by far the most bipartisan area of agreement in healthcare right now.
In the back. Hi.
That
I would, Mollyann might be the expert on that one. But I think that one thing that I will say about that is that we know that these views are very closely tied to partisanship, and that and our question about the ACA, like a lot of questions, does acknowledge that a lot of people call it Obamacare. So we definitely see that. And I will turn over your other question.
Yeah, I would say, I would start with the exact same thing, right? There's almost, we have shown over and over and over again that views on the ACA are entirely predictable by partisan identification, and it doesn't actually matter what your real life experience is with the ACA, that doesn't impact your views. So in fact, even people, we've done surveys of people in the non-group market, so the people who got health insurance basically and got it as a result of the ACA, and if they're a Republican, they still think that that they're worse off and they have much more unfavorable views than if they're a Democrat. So that is by far driving those results. Well, no, they forget. They're going to go back to a little bit. But Maureen, that's also exactly why the repeal and replacement debate turned out the way it did. Because as soon as they started hearing what would happen when it went away, they didn't like that either. So it's the classic. I don't know. You always got to just go back to Downs, right? Like Downs got it perfectly right. Like, do something. Do anything. Do something, but don't do that. Or don't do that. Don't do that. That's going to hurt me. Okay, and you get back to the status quo. So that what has happened is the ACA over the course of 10 years has actually become the status quo. Doesn't mean that anybody who has a Republican identification will ever say anything positive about it. Too many of the benefits are hidden and they don't realize it, and it's too easy. There's a target now, so everything they dislike about healthcare and about politics, about democratic politics, you can just point to the ACA as your punching bag. So those are the things going on. And their health insurance is also very expensive, and they have a lot of access problems in the rural area. There's a huge, huge issue with rural health, and that's a whole nother panel and conference. Yeah.
Priority, though,
yeah. Yeah.
For the individual or the family is not that list. Is that just not there?
It wasn't, that particular list was more about policy options and things that were going on. We have other lists where costs always come out on top. In fact, I deleted that. I was in my presentation, I deleted it.
Okay. Yeah, no, I figured it probably. There's one more thing because I'm saying that Medicare for all, Medicare for that supplemental private insurance, that, so if it's the beginning that is no private insurance, I don't think that is probably.
It depends. Again, it really depends on which proposal. So if you look at Senator Sanders' proposal or Senator Jayapal's proposal, they 100% get rid of the private insurance companies. And now a lot of the other proposals do not. And again,
they get rid of it.
Everybody is now part of Medicare. Basically, in many ways. Medicare changes. Medicare itself, there's a whole new program basically for everybody that becomes the law of the land that is much more generous than the current Medicare program. So there is no reason for Medicare anymore because the new program is a much more generous program, so you don't need all the wraparounds and things.
Sanders.
Call in on Tuesday and Tricia Newman will tell you everything.
Up here, yes, ma'am.
Hi, Natalie.
And she wants to know if Emily, if you looked at Hispanic by foreign-born, U.S.-born, and the USR break.
I did not look into that within the USR break, but Natalie, I would be happy to talk to you later. I'm not 100% sure what our sample sizes are once you break down within USR, but I will take a look at that for you.
Here's another question from Twitter. So Ariel from Molly, she says, is there any data whether the segment of Medicare for all focused Democrats are more or less focused on health care as a top issue in 2020 than the rest of the party? So whether this is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that's pushing this Medicare for all proposal more about health care than the rest of the Democratic Party?
That is an excellent question, Ariel, and I'm going to turn it to Ashley. Have we looked at that?
So I just didn't tweet her back.
I know. I was like, why didn't you? I don't think we know yet.
We don't know yet.
I think that's what we know.
We'll track for you. Yeah.
We have two in the back. Let's start on the right, and then my right, and then yes, sir.
Expanding that question more broadly, have you done any research looking at healthcare priorities broken out by vote ethnicity in general? Are voters who are more or less likely to vote in general, how do their priorities differ or shift compared to just likely vote?
It's a really good question, and what I can say is what we learned, what we saw in 2018, and we are not as focused on the vote as many of the colleagues in the room, but we did. We're generally just looking at registered voters, and then sometimes we'll go, how likely are you to vote? But we don't do complicated likely voter models or anything like that. But what we did find, I think, in 2018 that was interesting is when we looked at the responses in our national polls by battleground states, that healthcare was still important, but it was sort of less important than in some of the non-battleground sort of areas. So I think it's really consistent with a lot of these demographic trends and some of the stuff that Gary said, and it's this question of sort of Democrats geographically being more concentrated, so it's super important in those areas. In some of the more battleground places, which tend to be more of the red state areas, it ends up not being quite as I don't want to understate it. It was still an important issue, but not quite as fervent as it was in some of in some of the more very liberal progressive parts of the nation. And I have a question for Gary in a minute.
Okay, sir.
First, do you have any data on the time and affinity between Republicans that want that Medicare? That's the first question. That's the second question. There is a group who has Medicare for all. That's the elderly. Are they really partisan how they decide on these scale of Medicare for all, or are they just mostly invited, more willing to say that?
Those are both great questions. Wait, I'm going to do your second one first, and you're going to have to re-ask your first one because I got distracted. But okay, so on Medicare for all, the elderly. So Medicare is a very popular program, right? But as other people have alluded to, you really need a good supplemental plan. You need some other things to really be protected in the cost. Medicare itself doesn't really, in many ways, it doesn't have as much actual cost protection in just Part A as our most employer-based systems. But Medicare is popular. The elderly really do like it. In the past, they weren't generally that interested in opening up Medicare to other people because they were afraid of what it would do to their own program. And so we had been sort of expecting to see that result now, and we're not. So we are seeing that the elderly are over, as I get older, the over 65 population, not elderly, the over 65 population is not any less likely to be supportive of sort of Medicare buy-in and these Medicare buy-in or these Medicare for all than younger. It is very much partisan. So it's 100% partisan. On the ACA, it was also 100% partisan. We are watching for that. And if you looked when I had the slide up about various messages or arguments, one of those things is it would be bad for the Medicare program because that's certainly something that will come out and be used. And that is definitely something that makes people feel opposition towards any Medicare for all program. So it is, I think, a very powerful argument. I think right now it hasn't seeped through as something that would matter or not. And a lot of the actual policymakers and what the advocates argue that it's a very false argument, that there's no reason why a Medicare for all program would be bad for the Medicare program, because in many of these cases, as I say, it's a whole new program anyway.
First question, sorry. Whether there's a political time sequence for Republicans to warm up.
Yeah, that was a great question. The Medicare for all, surprise, the polling around Medicare was not as, it There wasn't as much of it as there is today. Let's just say in 1960s there was just less polling. Medicare was definitely a divisive issue. There was definitely as many unbelievable campaigns from the AMA and others who had resistance to it. There's lots of documentation. It didn't take that long for it to become part of the fabric of America. And again, you were giving people benefits who didn't have anything at the time. It was such a different time in our country. The elderly were the number one group in our country who had no health insurance. They were the poorest group in our country. It was a very sort of different sort of time. And when people saw the elderly, and it was their parents, whatever, getting that coverage, it was a pretty quick warming up. The other case that's actually really interesting is the Medicare prescription drug enhancement when they did Part D. That was another thing that was very unpopular, particularly among the Medicare population, but and Republicans. And we have a nice chart of the crossover, and it wasn't very long. We think it was a couple years from passage to implementation. But in both of those cases, people were just getting a lot of good benefits and not necessarily feeling a lot of the pain, because the pain was much broader spread out. The ACA, I will tell you, and I predicted in many panels like this, that we would see that as people got experience with the ACA and as people who really weren't that closely touched by it realized that the sky wasn't going to fall once the ACA passed, I expected opinions to change. We have plenty of predictive moments on film, probably, and certainly in some papers that said that we expected as people after 2010, 2012, once it was implemented, once you got through the healthcare.gov disasters, we expected that people would warm up to the program, and we haven't, and it's entirely because it's maintained its partisan fire. It was so effective. It's such an effective message for the Republican Party, and they never let go of fighting of the repeal and replace mantra, and that has and Republicans really did not like President Obama's administration, and they've been able to use it as its sort of symbol, even though they liked a lot of things that are in the ACA, and that's clearly one of the challenges you have with repeal and replacement now. There's a lot of things in it that people like, and they don't want to take it away, but I expected to see different charts. I didn't expect to see these horizontal lines, and they're still horizontal.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Gary.
Question up here?
So Gary, what does your data and your analysis imply about the Electoral College, and what do you think should happen with that?
Yeah, well, it's a good point. We don't have direct elections in this country, and for president, as we sometimes think, and we were reminded of that not too distant past. So the distribution, as I mentioned, I think at the end of my presentation, of Democrats nationally and of Democratic voting groups is problematic for the Democratic Party, particularly in terms of the Electoral College. They overvote in urban areas, and they undervote in many other areas of the country. And that makes Republicans competitive, even as the Republicans go through a period of increasing disadvantage in terms of the demographic constitution of the country. So it is, therefore, entirely possible for Republican presidential candidates to thread the needle and win the Electoral College, as we just saw. But it gets harder every time. And I think that's the main takeaway. I'm not talking about who's going to win the next election, but the long-term political future of the country and the extent to which it relies upon the demographic makeup of the country, which is changing more rapidly and more inexorably than we all often discuss already.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think the political equation and the political import of the demographic changes are coming. They're happening. We're in the midst of them. You have a population that is right now or about to be, as of 2020, the 18 and under population, or under 18 population in our country will be majority minority. That's happening, and that tells us what's going to happen in the future. As the older cohort goes on to the great ballot box in the sky, they're going to be replaced with an increasingly more diverse population. That's inarguable. The question is, what does it mean to our politics? And what we can say on that is that based on on voting patterns of past elections, in which we have non-whites generally, and then as we break it down into groups, voting by much higher margins for Democratic than for Republican candidates. The only way it changes is if Republican candidates and the Republican Party finds a way to appeal to non-white voters because they're running out of white. I think that personally would be a good thing. I like the idea of a two-party system in which there's good, healthy debate and competition for all voters. So I think in the long term, though, that's got to happen if the party's going to remain viable.
Doesn't it also create challenges for the Democratic Party as it gets to be a bigger tab? I mean, in a sense, this Medicare for All discussion, so much of it is being driven by, the enthusiasm of sort of a younger, and will there be parts of the Democratic Party who feel misplaced in the Democratic Party?
Look, it's hard to say, but my view is that political decision making is not so much about what we think, but about who we are. And I think that the policy outcomes that we see, the policy preferences that we see, are premised on the characteristics and, more importantly, or equally importantly, the worldview of the individuals that come to those policy decisions. We sometimes talk about partisanship and ideology, for example, as if they're starting places from being a Democrat or from being a liberal or a conservative, who then go on, or Republican, who then go on to policy preferences. I see those two as more of a mid-station, if you will. They're informed by who we are demographically and who we are socioeconomically, and who we are in terms of the worldview that we develop in our youth and young adulthood. And those factors are really hard to change. And those are going to inform our partisanship and ideology, which then inform our views on these policy issues. I think the order of march, if you will, starts at the demographic and at the socioeconomic level.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I don't know. In our data, Hispanics overwhelmingly self-identify as white, or to some extent, as when asked if they're white or black, say I'm Hispanic, right? So black Hispanics are not numerous enough, or haven't been in our data for much in the way of analysis. We've done some, and there's been much other data looking at it by language of interview, which is largely about, to some extent, about nation of origin, and there you do get some pretty significant differences, particularly on social policy issues, right? In which you get a more, I guess you could call moderate to conservative preferences among Spanish-speaking populations. I think it's an interesting thing to keep track of in the future. A beautiful thing about the growing Latino population is we get more and more of them in our samples, and we're able to do richer and deeper analysis of the population. That's a good place to go in the future.
Yes, ma'am.
So, and the whole thing you're talking about where it's a system in which both of them really do a lot of population. But you also mentioned an alternative chapter, so you're focusing on the and shooting down a lot of population. So, kind of giving that projection for practice are going and also thinking about that. Because we've seen a lot of that happen across the country in the States. And now, in some ways, we're seeing move towards issues and more forms of education that we prefer to go. So, what is some of the ways that I've seen that play out?
Well, I hate to put it this way, but a lot of voting participation is self-suppressed, if you will, right? So among young adults and among Latino and Hispanic, registration rates are pretty low. Participation rates are lower than they can and ideally should be. So while I think that concerted efforts by political or ideological groups to suppress voter turnout are objectionable, I think is an equal concern, at least equal, maybe greater concern, merely about the self-suppression, about the participation at the individual level that we all can either decide to undertake or not. So the hurdles and barriers that are erected are not that challenging to overcome if you've got the will and the desire, and that comes from a sense of self-efficacy. We know what it takes to motivate people to vote. They have to think that there's some problem, that participating in the solution is a better thing than not participating, and that their individual participation matters. And those have to be presented in a compelling enough way to get people to register and participate. I think that the efforts to suppress the vote on the one hand, or to prevent illegitimate voting, as will be presented on the other, are probably not as profound or as likely to be successful as might be hoped by those who exercise it, because the population is simply growing, and there's going to be more and more racially and ethnically diverse voters available to these motivation efforts. And I think that would be probably an appropriate response to it. The risk of doing voter suppression, while it might be appealing in the short term, is that it can produce alienation and resentment that could be a lingering problem for you in the future. The long-term strategy, the only one possible, given the demographic changes we see, is to appeal to a broader base of voters. And Democrats need to do that. They've been successful at it. Republicans need to do it as well if we're going to have a thriving two-party system. This is really that simple.
So I think we have time for one more question. Anybody? All right. Well, nothing like discussing the 2018 elections to get your heart rate up on a Saturday morning. So can imagine by the time we get to 2020 AAPOR, it's going to be a workout here. I want to thank our speakers, Gary, Mollyann, Emily. Great presentations, great commentary. Thank you for your great questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Go do great things.